Folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the social contract between the government and the governed, that the government shall only govern with the consent of the governed. Now, there were other aspects of it, but this was the essence of the social contract. Now, we see it's first talked about, or first gets sort of a famous place in history through the writings of Rousseau, and this feeds, of course, into the later French Revolution, but also into the American colonial revolution. So let's talk a little bit about that social contract and how today it's been discarded, I would argue aggressively discarded. And today, not only is the consent of the governed irrelevant, but any dissent against the globalist project is treated in effect as illegal and worthy of, as the globalists see it, at least some form of punishment. Now, I'll use Britain as the example here of evolving social contract rather than a social contract that's suddenly imposed. For example, the social contract of the French Revolution, equality and fraternity and all this sort of stuff. This was imposed with some brutality by the revolution, effectively at the point of a gun, and people were being arbitrarily arrested and killed. So to what extent it was a revolution that imposed justice can be questioned. Where in the terms of the rabid revolutionaries, was it social justice? That is, you killing off the aristocrats? Well, they may have perceived it that way. But as soon as you have arbitrary arrest and arbitrary law and no due legal process, as soon as you have that, then you cease to have justice, and you cease to have a social contract because it's not with the consent. Similarly, when any contract is imposed, or when any government structure is imposed, then by definition it's not with the consent of the people. Now, in the case of the American Revolution, the Constitution was written by some very bright guys that were obviously determined to make or produce a framework of government that would be fair and just and would allow people to pursue their happiness as it goes. And not that there wasn't some modifications, and not that there weren't these bright people like Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, Pope and others. I mean, there were quite a few people that played a role in that, and Franklin and so on, Benjamin Franklin. But effectively, it was done in what would be seen as really a single pass. Again, there were amendments, and there were to and fro discussions that went on later on when you look at sort of the Constitution, Bill of Rights amendments and those sort of things. Then there were further changes were made. And if you look at, say, read the writings of Alexander Hamilton at the time, who was quite a big player in that, as indeed was James Madison, then you look at that, and they were both of them were very concerned in slightly different ways, but concerned nonetheless about whether the project of American independence and this form of government they're proposing would get up. But there was a very small number of people who had a say in it, so it was effectively imposed. And that's a different form of consent than the British. Now in Britain, the amount of people who had the vote was quite small. You had to be fairly well off and that sort of thing. But the reforms to the electoral process and the extension of the franchise began in what was the 1832 Reform Bill. Now, this reflected the growing middle class and the change of the British economy and social structure as it began to move away from agriculture and landowning, which had hitherto been the basis for the aristocracy and the justification of it. They owned the land, and the peasants were the tenant farmers, that sort of thing. So moving to more areas of more industry and so on, and also identifying, if you look at the people who were inventing the spinning jenny, the steam engine, these weren't aristocrats. Aristocrats may have put up some of the capital for it, by the way, but these were people, common practical people. This is before engineering degrees and so on and university existed. These were practical people who'd maybe done apprenticeships, say, in boiler making, and they were able to look outside of that paradigm of just the boiler. I mean, say, hey, we can, this boiler, what we can do is we can actually make a steam train and so on. So you get these new breed of people coming forward that are there on their vision and their skill and their capability and their capacity to transfer knowledge in one narrow specific area into a wider field of endeavour. And the case of the steam train being one. So that was the changing nature of the British situation. Also, Britain had the benefit of being, they'd come out very well in the end from the Napoleonic Wars, and there was going to be pretty much a century where Britain really wasn't involved in any major war. Sure, there were some regional conflicts. The Crimean War is a case in point, but in terms of a major international First World military confrontation, and there was nothing really for 100 years. In fact, until World War I started. So this is so in the midst of that confidence and that peace and that certainty about tomorrow, the British establishment, not threatened by overseas invasion or not having their power directly threatened by other governments or other nations, they were able to take quite a relaxed attitude to sharing power. And you saw that in the reform. Now, there are a number of reform bills that went through, again, extending parliamentary franchise, and it was quite organic. And so I want to focus on that. So between, say, 1832 and the 1880s, so 1830 to, let's say 1830 to 1890, just to sort of round it off. In that 60 years, the British electoral system changed so that effectively 75% of men and approximately 10% of women had the vote. And that was kind of the high watermark, really, before there were some extensions here and there, but that was the high watermark before universal male, and then after that, female voting, the franchise was extended. So, but that period, 1830 to 1890, that was really where the idea of the social contract within the governed, the consent of the governed, and how that organically developed in Britain was probably the best example of that social contract occurring organically and again with the consent of the governed. So let's concentrate on that. What's sort of interesting when you look at any political proclamations or philosophical considerations, or where philosophy, politics, and the social contract kind of merge into one. And a lot of the works that had gone on before, whether it be Locke or Burke or any of those, they began to sort of coalesce into really a few statements. The willing obedience of the people. Now that's quite telling. So the people are agreeing. This is just going off the slogans of the day, but they're appearing everywhere in all manner of forms, including official documents. You agree to be obedient to it, which is abide by the laws, and be law-abiding and that sort of stuff, not commit crimes or not threaten the state if it comes to that. But you agree to be obedient, and willingly so. And so we agree to the social contract. You agree to be obedient, we agree, the government, to only do things with your consent. So it's government by consent. And as long as you're obedient, then we will seek your consent on all matters, is effectively the social contract here. And there's the comment here of the social agreement of a contented people. And again, I think that's an important statement that happens multiple times over, particularly not necessarily just from 1830, but it really picks up pace, say, mid-1840s. That was really kicks off there. Now, some of that comes from the revolutions in Europe, where consent wasn't sought to the same degree as it was in Britain. And so you had the 1848 type revolutions. The King of France was kicked out and sought refuge in England, for goodness sakes, Louis Philippe. But these are the these were things going on in the continent. The British establishment, if you like, was sensitive to this. So the idea of, why don't we concede a little bit and that'll keep the peace? So the idea of a harmonious arrangement where the willing obedience, the social agreement, a contented people, the consent of the governed, these utterances and phrases and so on were all over the place. And you still actually saw them even going into the 1970s in Britain and elsewhere in the world, in Australia, for example. And it was viewed as it's a social contract that lasted for almost 150 years. Now, there were disruptions to it, the wars as an example, the Great Depression as an example. So it wasn't a perfectly linear progression or anything like that. But it was never far from that. This was the idea. This was the default position, and not that there wouldn't have been some that would have disagreed, or Marxist revolutionaries that thought it was way too tame, and revolution has to be imposed at the point of a gun, all this sort of stuff. But these were people that believed the social contract must be by consent. As long as you have consent, the argument went, and which I agree with. Then you have a degree of contentment, and that consent was something that was central to at least the British politics. Now, to a lesser extent in the United States, because the United States had a huge amount of migrants. There were Catholics, there were Protestants, there were Italians, there were Irish, there were Russians, there were, you name it, all over there. So that the concept of consent was quite different. Not that it didn't exist, it did, but the concept of consent was strive and aspire to do better, and you can be whatever you want here. You can, anyone can become president, and you can start up a business and be successful and become rich. And these, that social mobility is what bound that American consent system together, which is being destroyed today and has been for a while, because merit's taken out of the equation now. So that social mobility is gone. Social mobility is now, I hate white people in a white society. Good, you can get a promotion. So it's become very perverse. It's how much you hate your fellow citizen has become the basis for an elevated social status. So merit's gone, which has caused a huge disruption to that social contract in America, to a different and differing extent in Europe. So in England, where there was, Britain, where there was a great deal of homogeneity, 99%, 99.5% of the population were of the same stock, then the same racial group, then the social contract was easier to put into effect because everybody was the same. Not that there weren't class differences, there were. Not that those class differences didn't play out in negative ways, they did. But this idea of the social contract was something that was essential to the British political system, the way it went. And if you read even cover the prime ministership in the 1950s and early 1960s of Harold Macmillan, the British prime minister, and you see his constant references in his writings and his private writings too of this social contract. The government is obligated to improve the lives of the citizens in return for their consent to be governed by us, the elected representative. We represent them, the consent, and so on. So this is constantly a theme. But you see a rather abrupt change in this start to occur in the 1970s, and particularly the 1980s, and then an aggressively abrupt change as soon as the Soviet Union, the big, powerful communist bloc, the Cold War and all that stuff, falls over in 1990. Then suddenly this consent of the governed almost disappears from the discourse. Bang, it's gone. And all the references to the social contract, the consent of the governed, or any government official is obligated or obliged to consider it as a default sort of moral or ideological position to take, that's gone. It's gone. There's no more fucking social contract. That is out the window. And we see today there is no social contract at all. It's been discarded, and it's now an imposed globalist ideology. And not only is the social contract and consent gone, but if you dissent, against the globalist project, then you're a fucking enemy of the state, an enemy of ideology, and you're going to be fucking punished, motherfucker. You've been with Tassel's today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.